This is the anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and how Trump has issued an executive order, or a proclamation, excuse me. And I want to share with you, before we put Lamar on to talk about this, what Dr. King said about the role of government, excuse me, in bringing about racial reconciliation and integration and tearing down the walls of white supremacy and all this sort of thing. So this is from his December 18, 1963, Barry Goldwater said, "You can't legislate morality." And this is Dr. King's rebuttal to that 54 years ago at Western Michigan University, December 18th, 1963. He said, "Now the other myth that gets around is the idea that legislation cannot really solve the problem, and that legislation has no great role to play in this period of social change because you got to change the heart. You can't change the heart through legislation, that you can't legislate morals. The job must be done through education and religion." That's him quoting basically Barry Goldwater. He says, "Well, there's a half-truth involved here. Certainly if the problem is to be solved, then in the final sense, hearts must be changed. Religion and education must play a great role in changing the heart. But we must go on to say that while it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that a law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that a law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also." So there is a need for executive orders. There is a need for judicial decrees. There is a need for civil rights legislation on the local scale, within states, and on the national scale from the federal government. And in Trump's proclamation today, his proclamation about Martin Luther King's assassination, he says, "It is not government that will achieve Dr. King's ideals, but rather the people of this great country." He's basically echoing Barry Goldwater. I can't believe this stuff is still going on. It's just astonishing. Meanwhile, Lamar Waldron is with us. Lamar is the author of Legacy of Secrecy, The Hidden History of the JFK assassination, and Ultimate Sacrifice. I played a role in Legacy of Secrecy and Ultimate Sacrifice, but Lamar is the principal author of all these books and a brilliant historian and political commentator. And Legacy of Secrecy, of course, is about the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Jack Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy. Lamar, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you, Tom, and I sure hope you're feeling better soon.
Oh, I'm feeling fine. My voice just sounds terrible. My apologies for that. But let's get into this. I'd like to take the whole hour and really dig into what happened with Dr. King and his assassination, and what you have learned in the research, the extraordinary research that you have done on this, and many other researchers whose shoulders you're standing on. First of all, your thoughts on what I just shared about the way that Barry Goldwater was framing the need to ignore legislation around civil rights, and the way that Dr. King pushed back on that, and how this all relates to Dr. King's legacy, and particularly how Dr. King's legacy has helped to change the hearts and minds of white people in this country over all these years, as a Southerner and as a white guy yourself.
That's an incredibly timely question. You can always count on Trump to provide headlines, usually to distract from something he wants people distracted from. But what he said today ties in so incredibly well. I was so glad to hear you talking about Goldwater, because he's the basis of one thing we're going to be talking about today, which is that political climate of 1968 and how similar it is today, not just in a vague, abstract way, but in a very hardcore way, especially in terms of racial politics and conservative politicians. And people are going to hear about just some amazing connections here. But when we go back to 1968, things were so polarized then. And then it was kind of easier to tell because you had people with long hair felt this way, some people with short hair felt that way, but even that can be misleading because most of the, say, anti-war protesters who were protesting the war or who were for civil rights, they didn't look like hippies. They looked like the school teachers, in some cases factory workers, housewives, that they were. So, but people were very polarized, and it was no accident that they were polarized. They were polarized then because of the divide and conquer techniques used by politicians at that time in a quest for more power and money, and they were fueled by really, really big money. And that's exactly what we see today, especially with this last presidential election in terms of Donald Trump, where you divide and conquer. You set working people of all races against each other. Now, it was a little more obvious back in 1968 because it was basically black versus white. Hispanic rights were basically still on the horizon back then. And, but all Trump did was take these proven techniques that all started with Barry Goldwater, by the way, that Nixon had used, and using some of Nixon's same people, did basically the same thing. So if we go back to 1968, and we're going to get to why King was killed that year instead of a few years earlier when there were lots more civil rights killings. Why wasn't he killed in 1964 when those civil rights workers in Mississippi were killed? Why was it about 68? Part of it was that incredible polarization driven by money and conservative politicians. And Nixon was using something called the Southern Strategy in 1968. The Southern Strategy was based on what Barry Goldwater had done in a spectacularly unsuccessful bid for the presidency in 64. Barry Goldwater lost in a landslide, but for the first time in I think since the Civil War, or maybe ever, Goldwater had carried the majority of the South. Okay, so when Republican strategists, and there was no better Republican strategist in history than Richard Nixon, the man who could get overwhelmingly reelected 6 months after Watergate. When you analyze Goldwater's spectacular loss, Nixon saw a way out of that. He said, look, if I can hold the South and turn that South Republican, because the South was largely on a local level, state level, was Democratic and would be for decades to come. But as we saw again with Trump, just because a state is basically Democratic doesn't mean you can't look at flipping it with some targeted tactics. And so what Nixon came up with a Georgian, I'm ashamed to say, called Bo Calloway. And if you and I don't play golf, but for people that do, there's Callaway as a name in golf clubs and stuff. The Callaway that helped Nixon come up with this was a failed candidate for Georgia governor who had actually won the governor's race in Georgia, but the conservative Democratic Georgia legislature took it away from him and gave it to Lester Maddox, the ardent racist. So Callaway worked with Nixon to come up with this Southern strategy. And what the Southern strategy is it's a way to hold the racists, but also get the moderates, the middle-of-the-road people, the professionals, by not being as overt in your racism.